Access. Our presentation today is Equal Access and LGBTQIA plus cultural competency. LGBTQIA stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, and asexual. And we are pleased to present this in partnership with the LGBTQ Speakers Bureau of the LGBTQ Youth Space. My name is Alicia Lemer. I am with Homebase, and I am excited to be presenting today with the amazing support of my colleague, Sadika. Next slide. Awesome. So welcome to the
And
Zoom
just for
room.
some Zoom,
Oh, go ahead, Sadika.
no worries. Just some regular Zoom housekeeping rules that you all are familiar with. We're going to keep you all on mute. Closed captions will be provided, but if you have any questions, any comments, please share them in the chat. And then if anything goes wrong, please message me directly in the chat. And I'm actually going to put my email in the chat too, in case anything goes wrong with you being in today's Zoom training.
So thank you, everyone. So for our introductions, we are going to be doing those in the chat. If you can just share your name, your organization, and what's one small thing that you do or that you want to do to take care of yourself during a busy week. Give a minute for those to start coming in. And welcome to our new folks who are joining. We are just doing introductions in the chat right now. See, taking time to engage in hobbies, running, taking a drive through the forest or along the coast, sleeping, nourishing the body, comfort food, good food, box breathing meditation, walking, breath work, setting positive intention, gym and powerlifting, good sleep. Daily walks are baking. So thank you everyone for sharing. Please feel free to keep sharing in the chat. I'd love to hear, once again, your name, your organization, and one small thing you do or want to do to take care of yourself. If you don't already have one of those, there are some great ideas in the chat right now. So thank you everyone for sharing. We're going to go to our next slide. Our agenda for today, we are once again talking about equal access and LGBTQIA plus cultural competency. We are going to start out with just some foundational language so that we are all on the same page. We are then going to talk about the HUD equal access rule, what that means for you and what that means kind of in a changing federal landscape. We're going to talk about some best practices for equal access and LGBTQIA plus cultural competency. And then we have the second half of our training is a really great opportunity to hear from the LGBTQ speakers panel on equal access. So they will be joining us at the top of the next hour. Thank you. All right, so our desired outcomes for today, we want to gain a working understanding of how the equal access rule applies to HUD-funded programs. also just want to establish shared language for understanding key terms and identities related to gender identity and sexual orientation. We want to be able to apply those best practices. We want to make sure that everything we take from here is really practical and that you are able to bring that into your day-to-day work in housing and homeless response. So with that, we are going to start going over some foundational language when it comes to gender and sexual orientation. All right, so this is a lot on one slide, but we're going to walk through it piece by piece, and you're going to be able to access these slides later. But really wanted to start, we're looking at four kind of domains that we're going to be talking about. The first is sex assigned at birth. Those are categories to which people are typically assigned at birth based on physical characteristics. This is typically what someone might have on their birth certificate. And its categories may include male, female, or intersex. Biologically, this can be defined through a combination of bodily characteristics, which includes chromosomes, hormones, internal and external reproductive organs, and secondary sex characteristics. As we talk throughout today, sex assigned at birth is not something that we use a whole lot in interacting with clients. There are some different forms and different ways in which this information may need to be collected. But what we really think about and what we really want to consider when we are working with our clients is gender identity. That is the internal, deeply held sense of a person's gender. That may or may not correlate or correspond to the sex assigned to them at birth. So gender identity is not determined by sex, and it is not defined by sexual orientation. For many people, their gender identity does match the sex that they were assigned at birth. That is called cisgender. For other people, their gender identity does not match the sex that they were assigned at birth. And for people who their sex assigned at birth and their gender identity are not the same, they may use terms such as transgender, trans, agender, non-binary, gender fluid, gender queer, or others to describe their gender identity and that internal sense of their gender. Then we have gender expression. This is the way that a person communicates their gender to the world. It's about how someone presents themselves. So it includes the way that people dress, hairstyle, makeup, appearance, mannerisms, speech patterns, even your name, your pronouns, and social interactions. So all of this really includes how the world is going to interact and how the person is interacting with the world. Once again, gender identity and gender expression do not always align. So it's really important not to see gender expression as telling you what someone's gender identity is. And some examples of gender expression are feminine, masculine, and androgynous. And then sexual orientation is a person's emotional, physical, and or sexual attraction to others. Once again, this may or may not be the same as a person's sexual behaviors. So a big thing we're going to talk about as we move through today's training is not assuming. And so sexual orientation is who they are attracted to. It is not the same as gender identity or expression. And it doesn't tell us necessarily about a person's behaviors. And some examples of sexual orientation include straight, lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual, and queer. Those are just some examples. There are many different ways that people describe their sexual orientation. So we want to provide some profiles that really are, they are from Teaching Sexual Health. And these provide some really great examples of those different categories of gender identity, expression, and sexual orientation in practice. So up on the top right, we have Mikey. Mikey uses they, them pronouns, and they identify as transgender. Their sexual orientation is pansexual. Oh, and just to go back, transgender refers to a person whose gender identity or gender expression is different from the sex that they were assigned at birth. Mikey also identifies as pansexual, which refers to a person who is sexually and or emotionally attracted to people of any sex or gender identity. Mikey's gender expression is masculine, and their sex was they were assigned female at birth or AFAB. You might see that acronym sometimes when people are referring to sex assigned at birth. Down in the left bottom corner, you have a profile for Rowan. Rowan uses she, her pronouns, and her gender identity is woman. Her sexual orientation is queer. And if you hear someone say that their sexual orientation is queer, that is an umbrella term that really refers to anyone who is not heterosexual and maybe not cisgender. Different people use this term to mean different things. So it has at times been used as a pejorative term against for people who are not heterosexual, but many people in the LGBTQ plus community now use that as an identifier for their sexual orientation. So in this case, Rowan uses queer to define her sexual orientation. Her gender expression is feminine, and she was her sex assigned at birth was she was assigned male at birth, also known as AMAB, AMAB. So these give you some ideas of how these different categories and kind of areas of gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, and sex assigned at birth look in real life and when we are interacting with real clients. So we talked about some of the terms and really setting the foundation of language that we want to be familiar with and language that we want to use. I think it's also important to cover some of the terms that we want to avoid and their alternatives. So on the top left, you will see we have biologically female, male, genetically male or female, born a woman or born a man. We want to avoid those terms because they oversimplify a very complex subject. A couple slides back, I mentioned all of the different factors that can go into defining sex assigned at birth. And we really want to recognize that this is a complex subject and really speaks to both sex assigned at birth and gender identity. So instead of using the terms on the left, we want to use the terms man, woman, boy, girl. So we don't want to have those qualifiers on front of those words. On the rare occasion that we do have to refer to someone's sex assigned at birth, you would want to say something like, assigned male, female at birth, but is a woman, man. On the left-hand side, we also have the term transgendered as a verb. Using the transgender as a verb suggests that being transgender is something that happens to a person, rather than reflecting who they actually are. Instead, we want to make sure we're using transgender as an adjective. Joanne is a transgender woman. And then our last term that we want to avoid is using both genders. We want to avoid that because it reinforces the false idea of a gender binary. So this idea that there can be only two genders. As an alternative, if we are talking about gender, we want to reference all genders. All right, so we have an activity. We are going to launch a poll and you are going to match, you are going to match the aspect of identity with the example term. So, and I know that I see that the poll launched. Thank you so much. I know this is a new type of poll for me. So I see 4 people have done this. Thank you. If you have any questions, let us know about how the poll is working. But you are matching the aspect of identity to the example, the aspect of identity on the left to the example on the right. I'm going to give a few more minutes to answer. Right. Thank you. I see folks answering. And we are going to go over the answers once the poll closes. I think just a few more seconds. All right. I think we are good. We had really great participation in that poll. Thank you so much. Excellent. All right. So we had people putting in their responses. We are going to go through. Thank you. We're going to see what the responses were, and you can kind of check along with what you said. So Sanika, if you are able to hit the next, it should pop up and give us some arrows. All right. So bisexual is an example of a sexual orientation. And androgynous is an example of gender expression. Assigned male at birth is an example of sex assigned at birth. And transgender is an example of a gender identity. Thank you, everyone, for doing that activity with us and really getting to put some of these concepts into practice. Right. So with that foundational information, we are then going to move into what this means when we are talking about HUD's equal access rule. So why is the equal access rule important? Why are we talking about this today? We know that equal access is important because trans and gender nonconforming people experience some of the highest rates of homelessness of any population. So we looked at some information from the US Transgender Survey, which was reported in 2022. It is the largest survey examining the experiences of transgender people in the United States, with approximately 27,000 respondents from all 50 states, including the District of Columbia, American Samoa, Guam, Puerto Rico, and US military bases. So really getting a lot of representation when we are looking at that survey data. And it reflects the ongoing disparities and patterns of mistreatment and discrimination against transgender people. Some of the data that we wanted to pull out for you was that in that survey, 30% of trans and gender nonconforming people had reported experiencing homelessness in their lifetime. 9% reported that they were denied equal treatment or service in the last 12 months because of their gender identity or expression. We also know that those experiencing homelessness are disproportionately LGBTQ plus, especially youth. So that brings us to HUD's equal access rule, which was implemented in 2016 as a requirement for all community planning and development programs through HUD. So this applies to all recipients and subrecipients of community planning and development funds, and those who administer programs and services and provide temporary emergency shelter funded through those as well. So those programs include the Continuum of Care program, emergency solution grants, the home investment Partnerships Program, Housing Trust Fund Program, Housing Opportunity for Persons with AIDS, our HOPWA, and Rural Housing Stability Assistance Program. So if you are a recipient of any of those funds or a subrecipient, then this applies to you. HUD's Equal Access Rule is focused on access to shelter, housing, and services, and making sure that those services are provided in accordance with an individual's gender identity. So we talked about the difference between sex assigned at birth, gender identity, and gender expression. We are going to make sure that access and placement into programs is based on gender identity, or that self-reported internal sense of gender that people share, regardless of their gender expression. As part of the equal access rule, programs are not allowed to ask intrusive questions or require proof of someone's gender identity. And providers must update and maintain policies and procedures to reflect these requirements. Finally, programs under HUD Equal Access Rule must take non-discriminatory steps to address privacy concerns. Over the next few slides, we are going to delve into the different pieces of this in more detail, providing you with what this means in day-to-day work and examples of best practices around this. So in terms of what you must have in order to meet the requirements of the Equal Access Rule in your policies and procedures, you're going to want to make sure that your policies and procedures ensure equal access to the programs that you operate for all individuals and their families. So regardless of sex assigned at birth, gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, there is also an aspect of the Equal Access Rule that relates to preventing family separation. And we are going to address that in a future training. But so just acknowledging that there are multiple components to the Equal Access Rule. Today, we are focusing on gender identity and LGBTQIA plus cultural competency, but there is that other aspect as well that we will be speaking to in the future. As part of your policies and procedures, you also need to make sure that you're providing housing services and accommodations in accordance with your client's gender identity, and make sure that you are determining eligibility without regards to actual or perceived sexual orientation, gender identity, or marital status. So really speaking about having a client-centered approach to access, placement, and ongoing services for the clients that we serve. So there are some programs that are operated according to gender. So you might have a men's shelter and a women's shelter. And so there are some considerations within the Equal Access Rule for those kinds of facilities as well, where there might be shared sleeping or bathing areas, as well as those separate areas for different genders. When there are facilities with shared sleeping or bathing areas, the Equal Access Rule states that placements must be made based on an individual's gender identity. So that is a really crucial piece of this. And it also speaks to the next part, which is providers must take any non-discriminatory steps that are necessary and appropriate to address privacy concerns raised by residents. So when we talk about non-discriminatory steps, that means taking measures that do not impact that individual's access or experience of the program. So when there is a privacy concern that is raised by residents or occupants, the reaction to that should not be to isolate a person or to segregate them, but rather to change the space itself. So for example, if a trans man comes to you and says that he is feeling uncomfortable showering in the congregate bathroom that does not have any stalls or curtains, the appropriate response to that and a non-discriminatory step is to make changes to the showering area so that everyone is ensured greater privacy. The action that would not be appropriate in this situation would be to force the the person who came and told you that he was feeling uncomfortable to shower at a different time than anyone else. That would not only not be in alignment with the equal access rule, but can really break down trust and make someone feel like they are being treated differently, that they are being isolated and segregated. Another example that we see quite often is, there are men's and women's multi-stall bathrooms and a single stall bathroom. If a client is uncomfortable, we can ask why and what would make them feel comfortable and give them options, which could include, but should not be limited to, using the single stall bathroom or using the bathroom at a different time. So really being able to provide a range of options that allow for the person to choose what is going to make them comfortable. And then making sure that faculty admissions, occupancy, and operating policies are updated to ensure compliance. So all the things that we are talking about today, making sure that those are reflected in your policies and procedures, as well as some of the trainings that you provide to staff. So this is a incredibly important slide, because when we talk about making sure that people have access and are placed according to their gender identity, we are really speaking about self-identifying gender and making sure that people are able to self-identify, and that those decisions are not based on a perceived gender identity. So when we talk about actual gender identity, we are talking about that self-identification. And in this example, I am a man. That is a person's deep internal and personal sense of their own gender. Once again, as we talked about earlier, that may be different than the gender listed on an individual's identity documents. Those documents should not determine a person's gender identity. We are listening for what that person self-identifies as. And we don't want to assume, we always want to ask. And so that's on the right side. That is perceived gender identity, when we are making assumptions and not asking the person. That is when someone says, you look like a man. That is an external assessment of a person's gender by others based on their appearance, their name, their behavior, or other factors. So that is something that is controlled by the observer, not the individual themselves. And it may not be correct. It may be based on stereotypes or assumptions. So when you are thinking about gender identity, when you are talking to a client, we always want to focus on self-identification and not assuming. We really want to acknowledge that we are in times of change. The federal policy environment is shifting, but the equal access rule is still important, and inclusive non-discrimination policy remains incredibly important to the programs that are operated through HUD and through the Provide Housing and Homeless Response. So the equal access rule is not currently being enforced by HUD, but it is still the law of the land. It is still in effect, and it has not been repealed. So it is still on the books. And in addition to that, California civil rights laws provide following protections for emergency, overnight, transitional, and domestic violence shelters that very much reinforce what we see in the equal access rule. So what California civil rights laws cover is that shelters cannot discriminate based on gender identity or gender expression. Clients must be allowed to access facilities consistent with their gender identity, and providers can not require proof of gender, whether that's medical, legal, or anatomical. So acknowledging that equal access rule is still important, it is still in place, and it is following what we talk about today with equal access rule related to gender identity is a good way to make sure that you are lowering your risk of not being in compliance and of making sure that you are serving clients in the best and most client-centered way possible. So when we think about implementing equal access for HUD-funded programs, we talked about this throughout this section, but really wanted to reemphasize that we want to continue to place clients consistent with their gender identity. You want to maintain LGBTQ plus inclusive non-discrimination policies, and to continue training staff on respectful and culturally competent interactions. We are going to talk about that even more during the second part of our training today. And you cannot require documentation or proof of gender. And just wanted to reiterate on the past slide that it is never appropriate to ask a transgender person about their medical history. So whether or not a person has had surgery does not determine a person's gender for the purposes of anything that we are talking about today. So even if HUD enforcement does change at the federal level, and we are still monitoring that, we may still see information of that coming down the line, California law still requires the practices that are on this slide and that we've been talking about in this section. Right, so we are going to delve deeper into some of the best practices in equal access and LGBTQ plus cultural competency. So really bringing this into the day-to-day and the work that everyone does. All right, so thinking about equal access when it comes to outreach, engagement, and assessment. That looks like accepting the name and gender given by an individual, using the pronouns as indicated by the individual, and if an ID is required, really, we know that the gender identity that someone tells you may not match what is on their ID. Use the gender identity that the individual tells you. Once again, we want to ask, we want to reinforce what someone is telling us their gender identity is. And this is going to allow someone to be more comfortable and continue in the outreach, engagement, and assessment processes. We know that all of these processes, outreach is really built on trust. Those early engagement processes are based on building rapport. So accepting a person's name, their gender, using the correct pronouns that they tell you, that really helps people to feel respected. And it may give important information not included in your assessment that will assist in finding them the right services. And we also do know that sometimes having these conversations can be triggering, and people might be combative or they might have strong feelings. This is just a reminder of using client-centered, trauma-informed approaches and knowing that sometimes if the conversations are can be difficult, that is not on you. Like, it is being able to build that trust with folks can take time. You can also go back and confirm responses, but if someone says they identify a certain way, don't say things like, "Are you sure?" Or if you are going back, make sure that you are confirming in a very neutral way all of the information that you received. We also know that language and identity is constantly changing. So this means you may have to update your intake forms every so often and check and make sure that they are aligning with the latest best practices. So going along with outreach, engagement, assessment, and enrollment, which is going to be on our next slide, we did want to take a second and think about data collection because we know that reporting this information, as I mentioned, can be difficult and it can be traumatizing for clients, especially when items like legal name and sex assigned at birth are required. So when we think about taking a trauma-informed approach and commitment to this work, affirming a person's gender identity is really key here. So some things that we can do to really take a trauma-informed approach to data collection is really commit to maintaining data confidentiality and being transparent with the client about that. Letting folks know who is going to see the information, why it is being collected, and making sure that that informed consent and that information is really there. We also want to make sure that we are asking for self-identification, that we are giving a full range of options and not making assumptions. So for this one, I want to make a note that for folks who are using HMIS, there was recently a change in the data element that gender is no longer what is required to be collected by HUD, because some communities are still collecting it, but they have changed it to sex and have changed the response options to female, male, client doesn't know, client prefers not to answer, and data not collected. In that situation, we want to let folks know that we want self-identification. We want to give them that full range of options, which includes that they don't have to answer, that they can refuse, they can prefer not to answer. We don't want to force clients to answer. We don't want to guess, and you don't want to assign or make assumptions based on appearance or based on gender expression. Regardless of those answers, once again, we always want to go back to respecting the name and pronouns that the individual uses. We want to affirm for our clients that the response that they provide will not affect services provided, and affirm that the agency is committed to providing a safe and respectful space. Right. So in terms of equal access and enrollment, as I mentioned, we had outreach, engagement. Now we are at the point of enrolling someone in a program. We want to make sure that we are providing folks with confidential areas to describe the services that the client may want and to ensure client about the confidentiality of the information that they provide. As I mentioned, being clear about the data collected, and then continuing to respect their gender identity, their name, and pronouns. We know that sometimes programs and systems are difficult to navigate and that they may be based on gender. And we want to think about some specific ways to support in those situations. So if someone is navigating services that are based on gender, we want to explain if services are set up in a binary way. So letting folks know that there is a woman only and men only shelter, making it clear that you understand that gender is not binary, that you are listening, that you are going to respect the gender identity the person shares with you. You can provide information and really lean into that relationship of working with your client, especially your clients who are non-binary or gender non-conforming, to make an informed decision that is best for them and accept your clients without regard for gender expression. On the flip side, things that we don't want to do and things that would undermine equal access at this point would be to turn away potential clients based on their gender identity. We also don't want to treat a client in a way that violates their confidentiality around gender identity. And we want to make sure, so if we are looking at things we don't want to do, we don't want to disrespect the client's assessment of their own safety or try to encourage them to go to a program that we think is going to make them most comfortable. It should not be based on the staff person's perceptions, but really on that person making an informed choice and an informed decision based on the information that we can provide. So then thinking about equal access when it comes to units and bed assignments, this looks like working with the client as well as working with other clients in the space. So quickly resolving conflicts if there is harassment by another client, if there are issues that come up, making sure that those are handled quickly and respectfully, modeling appropriate respectfulness, and really working with clients that express verbal and nonverbal disrespect. We are going to be talking about that more in the second part of our training and giving some examples of how we can respond to that, but knowing that it's really important to create a safe environment, and that means having that respectfulness, having those conversations, and making sure that we are looking at what is going to be restorative. And then we also want to provide confidential spaces to allow clients to discuss issues related to harassment or other concerns that might be connected to their gender identity and expression within the project. So providers should not, when there are challenges, when there are conflicts, one of the things that we don't want to do is move the more compliant client when conflict arises, even if they are the subject of harassment. So again, we want to make sure that we're doing non-discriminatory steps, and we're not removing or segregating people based on their gender identity. And we, once again, want to make sure that we are addressing all parties when a conflict arises. All right, in terms of ongoing services, we want to think about really recognizing a client's right to access all services for which they are eligible. So really making sure that that is a part of case management and service provision. We want to make sure that, as things come up, as there are potential conflicts happening, that we are correcting any kind of misconceptions that come out around gender expression and gender identity, and any misconceptions around safety risk that might be associated with that. We want to ensure that all clients understand the verbal and physical bullying is not to be tolerated. All right, so creating a culture of LGBTQIA plus competency. There are a couple different things that go into this, and this is not an exhaustive list. This is different aspects that you may already be working in your projects. These are things that you might be constantly evolving and evaluating. That is perfectly fine. We know that this is a journey. We know that people are looking at these different aspects of their work and adjusting, evaluating, and seeing where you're at. So, some of the aspects of creating a culture of LGBTQIA competency includes having those written expectations for staff and management around what appropriate and affirming behavior looks like. Having guidelines for collecting and maintaining sensitive data. This is really important and really embedded into a lot of the requirements, not just with equal access, but also just if you're using HMIS, your HMIS data standards. Having gender neutral bathroom options. Having a culture of asking and respecting name, pronouns, title, and name and terms of reference. When we talk about terms of reference, those are things like parent, sibling, making sure that we're being inclusive when we are using language to refer to relationships. Having guidelines for addressing harassment, bullying, violence, or discrimination. It's always good to have those guidelines and to have folks ready and aware of them, to make sure staff understand those guidelines before anything does occur. We don't want to have to make guidelines in the moment when something happens in a project. We want to make sure that everyone is comfortable and familiar, and that they also know who to talk to at a higher level. We want to have safe and accountable grievance process for residents and staff as it relates to issues of, once again, harassment, bullying, violence, or discrimination. We have heard and seen a lot of success with having visual cues in programs that really indicate that this is a safe, welcoming, and inclusive space. So being able to have visual cues like rainbow decor, having pins and other signs that let folks identify their pronouns, those can be really helpful things. Even visual cues on the forms that people use. So having expansive options for sharing about gender identity and sexual orientation. And then having partnerships with gender affirming healthcare providers whenever that is possible. We know that is a big service area that folks might need help connecting to. So knowing who those partners are and where where your clients may be able to go to get gender affirming care. So we have two polls for on this slide. And so our first one is, what do you have right now? And you can select all that apply. This is a completely anonymous poll, so please don't worry about who is going to see this. We would just love to find out and share among your peers. What do you feel like you are doing really well right now and that you have? As a reminder, you can select all that apply. We see a lot of responses coming in. I'm going to give a few more seconds. Right. About 10 more seconds for folks to respond to this poll. All right. And I think that we can end the poll now. So really great responses. We have a lot of folks who have that culture of asking for and respecting pronouns and name. We have a lot of folks who have their data collection guidelines. We have written policies and expectations for staff and management. Um, I know that gender neutral bathrooms can be hard based on the structure of your so I see folks do have that and have been working on that. We have guidelines for addressing harassment. Thank you so much, visual cues, partnerships with gender affirming healthcare. So there's a lot of great work happening among providers and within the community. So if you are working on any of those, please feel free. You might be able to find others who are a little bit further along and that you can do some peer sharing with. And then our third poll is going to be asking what you believe your project has, where you think your project has the most room for improvement. So this is selecting one. So looking at all of the options and determining which one you could use the most support on. We have more responsive policies, more responsive employee standards and guidelines, increased staff comfort with serving LGBTQIA clients, making physical spaces more inviting and responsive, increasing partnerships to provide gender affirming services, and more information and accountability in the grievance process. So we are going to give a few more seconds for this one as well. Okay, 10 more seconds for folks to respond. And I think we can close the poll. All right, so we see a lot of folks looking for increased partnerships to provide LGBTQIA plus and gender affirming services. We also see some interest in making physical spaces more more inviting and responsive, and increasing staff comfort. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing where you're at and also where you're hoping to go and the things that you are looking to focus on to move forward. Right. So as we talk about that culture of creating LGBTQ plus competency, we've talked about this a little bit before, but really wanted to provide quick, a quick kind of summary before we go into our speakers panel of the culture of competency around using pronouns. So when we talk about pronouns, we are talking about language tools that we use to refer to people other than using their names. Using someone's correct pronouns is an incredibly important way of showing respect, affirming someone's identity, and really creating that culture of culturally competent care. We know that some people may be comfortable with using more than one set of pronouns. So they might, for example, use he, they. In that case, using both sets of pronouns interchangeably is validating for the individual, regardless of their gender expression. So some examples of pronouns, we have he, him, his, she, her, hers, they, them, theirs, sie, her, hers, and they, zier, ziers, and zierself. So as I mentioned, people may use one set of pronouns. They may use different sets of pronouns interchangeably. So just being aware and really coming back to that culture of asking what a person's pronouns are. Some tips for asking. I know I've said this many times, but it is at the very front here, always asking and not assuming. Another really big piece is to avoid using phrases like preferred pronouns, our preferred name. That can suggest some element of flexibility or that someone's identity is less than valid, that it is preferred and that it is not the authentic or real version. So, we want to avoid that language around preferred because we want to make sure that we are not invalidating people's experiences and suggesting that is preferred over something else. We also really, this is a really key piece and it ties into those conversations about confidentiality. We want to be aware that people may use certain pronouns in some context and not in others for a variety of reasons, including safety. So, for example, someone may be openly transgender at work, but not at home with their family. So, really, having conversations, being responsive, and being really aware that sometimes people do use different names and different pronouns depending on the context. And it can be really important to clarify that with someone. We want to make sure we're using the appropriate name and pronouns in all paperwork and conversations, even when the person isn't present, unless the person asks otherwise. Once again, going back to potential situations in which someone maybe doesn't feel safe. And then asking politely and privately for clarification if needed. I am not going to linger long here because we're going to talk about this in some of our scenarios that are coming up. But we did want to, address that when someone does use the incorrect pronouns, the wrong gender honorifics that don't match a person's identity or a person's dead name, that is called misgendering, which occurs when someone is referred to using gendered items that don't align with their gender identity. And we are going to hear more about this from the panel, but just some high level tips for avoiding and repairing harm if someone is misgendered. We want to avoid misgendering by, once again, always asking, never assuming. You can set the tone by introducing yourself with your pronouns first, whether that is in conversation, in email, in all different types of ways in which you might be interacting with someone. You can address the person using their name rather than pronouns if you do not know their pronouns and you haven't had a chance to have that conversation. You can use gender neutral language whenever possible. So instead of saying father or mother, using the term parent, instead of saying husband, wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, using partner. And same with child, sibling, and other terms that may be gendered. And we can repair harm when someone does use the wrong name, pronouns, or terms. We know that this happens. We know that mistakes happen. So, in terms of repairing harm in those situations, it is first and foremost important to apologize sincerely, to also keep that apology brief and direct. You do not want to dwell on the situation or really make the situation about you. And sometimes, if apologies go on too long, it can just take away from the harm that was caused and repairing the harm for the person. And it brings the attention on the person who is apologizing. You want to correct yourself by using the right name, pronoun, or term. And in all of those situations, avoiding defensiveness, justification, or excuses. Really focusing on repairing harm and moving forward with using the correct terms and pronouns. Right. And with that, we are at the end of this portion of the presentation, and I am so excited to hand it over to our LGBTQ speakers panel. Sadhika, do I hand it back to you first, or?
I just want to, Justin, I see that you're off mute, so I can hand it to you. Would you prefer I take the slides down when you do your introduction?
No, no, it's fine. We can keep them up. I'll keep it short and sweet. Perfect. Hello, everyone. I am really glad that I was able to sit in on a little bit of the training because I think the Speakers Bureau panel that we have is really going to do a great job on putting some real lived experiences, some real folks, and a great plethora of identities to answer some of the questions that you might have about some of the scenarios you might be facing. So I'll introduce myself very quickly and then we'll go into our panelists to introduce themselves so we can get right into the scenario analysis and take some of your questions if you have any. So again, my name is Justin. I use he, him pronouns. I am the coordinator for the LGBTQ Youth Spaces Speakers Bureau. If you're unfamiliar with the youth space, we're a drop-in center based here in San Jose, and we're open for youth 13 to 25-year-olds. However, we have a really cool Speakers Bureau volunteer program, which is multi-generational. So we have folks as young as like 13 in our group to folks in their 60s and 70s and beyond. So it's really cool. It's one of my favorite things that we offer and that I get to do here with the space. So to give you a little bit of a background on what it is that Speakers Bureau and particularly does, again, we're a group of volunteers here to share these conversations with y'all with the goal of fostering connection, raising awareness, and educating audiences like y'all about LGBTQ plus identities and experiences. So again, this is a great opportunity for you to ask us any questions that you might have and also hear some perspectives from folk in the community that can maybe inform some of the scenarios you might encounter in the work that you're doing. Just a couple ground rules before I hand it over to Sarah to introduce herself first. If you have any questions, we will save them for the end. I will go ahead and read out each of the scenarios, and then our panelists will share their perspectives. And then if you have any clarifying questions or any other needs, we'll take those at the end of those scenarios. And then just a friendly reminder, of course, we're not ambassadors for the entire LGBTQ plus community as much as I would like us to be, but it's just impossible to showcase all of the wonderful identities within the community. So we have a great plethora of folks here today, and I'm excited to share their stories with y'all. But our panelists will let you know ahead of time if there's anything that they don't feel comfortable speaking about. But other than that, this is a safe space for learning. So I encourage you to ask whatever questions you need. And with that being said, I will introduce our first panelist, and I will hand it to the wonderful Sarah to introduce herself first.
Hey, friends. And Justin, I have to say, when you said intergenerational, I just feel so seen. But hey, folks, my name is Sarah. I use she and her pronouns. I identify as a queer, trans, Filipina woman. Um, in terms of where I'm from, born and raised here locally in the South Bay. Uh, for most of my life, I've been living in the San Jose area. In terms of like my role, I'm here in my lovely office and we're moving spaces, so that's why it's not as decorated. Normally, you might have been hearing talks about how you can make your spaces more inclusive, but we're in the process of moving to another building. So apologies if I don't have that kind of like environment, but this is something I'm pretty sure you'll learn about. But I lead and manage the County of Santa Clara Office of LGBTQ Affairs and have been doing so for the past 5 years now. In terms of kind of like my role in the community, I also was a former chief diversity officer for Silicon Valley Pride and part of the executive leadership community team for the Human Rights Campaign Foundation. In terms of things I like doing in my spare time, I do love playing the bass guitar. I love going out, to see movies even by myself because I think that's the best way to just, you know, just absorb everything that's going on in the cinema because I love pure cinema. And I like being a foodie. So if you're looking for the best pho place or best burritos in the South Bay, holler at your girl. But that's just a little bit about myself. I'll pass it up back to Justin.
Thank you, Sarah. All right, we will hand it over to Benjamin to introduce himself next.
Hello, everyone. My name is Benjamin. I identify as a gay Puerto Rican Latino man. Sometimes I go by they, them, depends on certain days, but he, him mainly are my pronouns. I grew up in the South Bay of San Jose as well, so holler at you, Sarah. Um, um, Grew up with a lot of, I want to just put a little background, and grew up with a lot of toxic masculinity in a Latino household, a lot of oppression of like mentally of yourself because had to deal with Latino parents that were very religious and didn't really were accepting of like a alternate lifestyle compared to what they knew and was passed on from generation to generation. Um, the biggest thing that I like to do is to be on these panels to increase awareness and to speak on my stories and allow others to inadvertently, subconsciously feel safe to express their own. Um, the biggest thing that I would love to share with you, is at least in regards to identity, is at least what I've gone through for like my own kind of like orientation and gender. So thank you. Back to you, Justin.
Thanks, Benjamin. All right, we will hand it over to Angie to introduce herself next. Alicia and Sadakai didn't see that she was made. Oh, she doesn't show the waiting room. Perfect. Let's see. Angie, are you here with us?
Hello.
Perfect.
Can you guys hear me okay? Or can y'all folks hear me okay? All right. Well, thank you so much. I apologize that I've been trying to switch from my phone to my laptop for like minutes now. So I'm glad it worked out just in the nick of time. But thank you all so much for having us. My name is Angie Hawkins. I use she, her pronouns, and I identify as a queer, Latina, Mexican American, Bay Area native woman, mom, wife. My wife and I have been married for almost 8 years. Been together for almost 10, and we have a 2.5-year-old baby. Well, he's kind of a toddler now, I guess. He's like 2.5 years old. His name is Larry. So baby Larry in the house. And we also have a dog and a cat, and the dog is actually getting her leg amputated right now. So that's where I'm coming from. So I'm a little bit scattered, but I'm getting grounded. Yeah, I think, I love being on these panels because I think they're a really amazing space for just like curious, non-judgmental, open dialogue. And so, as we share our stories, I just really encourage everyone to trust that we as panelists know that you're coming with good intentions and open hearts and open minds, and we're doing the same. And so, I think as far as my lived experience, like I also grew up in a very what would now be the religious right, but like kind of evangelical Christian focus on the family, Dr. James Dobson, like, purity culture, just household where, sexuality wasn't even on the table. It was sex that was dirty and sinful. And, of course, that was within a heteronormative, reproductive context. But even then, it was not, something to be talked about or explored in a healthy way. And so I had a lot of unlearning to do once I, went to college and grad school and kind of came of age. And I think that I only really started questioning when I turned 25. So I feel like I'm 40 now. And I feel like over the last 15 years, I just am living in a much more whole way. And I think that I'm excited to share more about that with y'all. So thank you for having us.
Thank you, Angie. So excited to finally have you on a panel with me. All right, we will hand it over to Alfred to introduce themselves last, and then I am excited to get into our scenarios.
Hi, everybody. My name's Alfred too. I live in Berkeley in the East Bay, where I also serve on the Planning Commission and the Rent Stabilization Board, working on a lot of housing and tenant issues. I also work as an architect, and my identity, I identify as trans and non-binary. I go by any pronouns. My family moved to the United States from Taiwan. I was born in the Bay Area and have lived in Berkeley and Fremont, and I'm currently 41. So happy to answer all your questions.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Alfred. Thank you, everyone, for sharing a little bit about yourselves. As y'all can see, we have a really awesome, diverse panel with lots of identities and perspectives that I think can inform the scenarios that y'all might be encountering and the work that you do. So whoever is controlling the slides, let's get started. All right. So I will read the scenarios to the group, and then panelists, feel free to answer the questions as you feel are applicable to you, or whatever little 2 cents you want to throw in for the group. All right. So this is scenario 1, and it will discuss the topic of pronouns. So during our intake, Jordan says, I use any pronouns, whatever is fine. A question for anyone that would like to share a little bit about your own experience with pronouns. What does any pronouns mean in practice to you?
Sure. I'll lead off because that is exactly my situation. I would say in practice, it means exactly what it says on the label. Any pronouns are fine. Now, I also know other people for whom they enjoy when people use the different pronouns interchangeably, or they may have different preferences depending on how they're presenting. So it's always good to ask. And yeah, as far as recording lists on documentation, I would say just put down any pronouns, but if there's any clarifying details to also note that.
Thank you, Alfred. Benjamin, I wonder if you might want to chime in on this one a little bit as well, since you mentioned that sometimes you kind of differentiate between using he, him pronouns and they, them pronouns as well. How do you think this scenario might apply to you?
Well, sometimes I'll dress a little feminine. I'll dress like a little bit more like maybe I might have my beard shaved. I might, be a little more, as they say, like girly. Um, and for me, it's at that point, it's he, him, she, they. Like, there's not much preference for me to just like restrict. Like, gender is a construct. It's this thing we make up in regards to our gender roles and what somebody is. You could look at somebody and not really know what their biological sex is. So for me, at that point, if I'm looking a little more feminine, like there's no preference for what I would prefer somebody to call me.
Yeah, thank you both for sharing. I'll open this to anyone in the panel who feels sharing or feels like sharing. But of course, before we move on to the second question, Sarah and Angie, did y'all want to chime in at all about what any pronouns might mean in practices that y'all are a part of?
Sometimes I, depending on like the relationship between who you're talking to and if there are any power dynamics present, at times I have wondered if saying any pronouns or whatever you like or whatever is fine can sometimes be more about trying to maybe make me feel comfortable or just kind of not maybe understand or trust even that I would be a safe person to disclose pronouns to. And so sometimes I'll respond and say, it really is, however you identify. And so, if you do have pronouns that feel best to you or most authentic to you, like, please let me know, because I would love to kind of affirm that. And so, like I have a staff member who is one of my direct reports right now who has indicated that they're kind of in this boat. And so, sometimes I'll check in with them and just be like, how are you doing? Like, I know we've talked in the past about they, them versus she, her. And, is there anything that I can do to support you in that? And, we have a very close relationship. And so even though I'm this person's manager, like it's not weird or invasive for me to check in this way. Like we frequently talk about queer things generally. So I think that's just one way as a cisgender person that I try to be very explicit about my support for affirming someone's pronouns and to if I feel like I'm sensing any hesitation, then I'll just kind of make it clear too that it's up to you. Like I think it's not about what I prefer and it's not about what makes me comfortable. Like it's not about me. This is about you and I want to support you. So yeah.
Thanks, Angie. Sarah, did you want to chime in at all?
Yeah, just really quickly in practice, you might have forms that have kind of like what pronouns people use. And there's two things I think when it comes to best practice. Some people that use any pronouns might check up all the boxes, right? If it's multi-select. But you might only have that one selection. And one thing I do want to emphasize is that people shouldn't be boxed in and say like, okay, but what is your preferred pronoun? It's like, there should be a write-in option for people to just write in, like, maybe it's an option for another pronoun set. And for them to be able to write any is just so affirming for people. So just be mindful. It's like, it's not a preference and it's an identity and they shouldn't be asked for it. The preference is rather just put that in the data set. Don't ask them for a preference and find different ways for social data collection. I'm pretty sure there's like a lot of resources to be able to create those data sets. So that's just my 2 cents for that.
I am really glad that you mentioned that, Sarah, because I think that chimes in perfectly or transitions perfectly with the second question, which was how can this be recorded in paperwork and other documentation? Unless anyone on the panel wants to chime in with other ideas too, I think Sarah's option for having like that write-in option, right, or not asking folks to simply, check off like one or a few of the boxes can be really helpful, especially in this practice. And just like what Angie mentioned too, as well, being able to have that verbal check-in as well, like what pronouns can I refer to you in this space? What pronouns would you like me to refer to outside of this space? I think that's a great way to handle it. Let's see, I did see that we have a question in the chat about this scenario, so I'll go ahead and look that over. All right, so Christian is asking, you all prefer to be called by your pronouns and not your names, is that right? Do you get offended if people call you by your name, regardless of the clothes you are wearing that day? Thank you for asking this question, Christian. I think this is a good option to have some clarity on this. So for folks in the panel, how do you feel about the difference between being addressed by your pronouns or your name, maybe both? Sarah, I know in our training yesterday, we kind of had a little bit of this conversation. So if you want to start off, go for it.
I would love to. Yeah, I think one option would also be within, especially if you have this like documented, right, when you're doing intakes, also having the option name only, right? So not only do you have kind of like an option for people to write in any and all pronouns, but also having that checkbox just to say by name only. And that way it's clear when you're addressing, any person that you just call them by their name. So that's what I would recommend. I'm interested to hear what other panelists think too.
Yeah, I would agree. I would say also though, the one situation to avoid is where you call somebody only by their name, but only single them out in doing that if they haven't requested to do that. And yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Alfred. I think that's exactly what I was hoping that we could get at here. And thank you, Christian, for that answer. And then Fantasy, I saw also asked a similar question where she asked, what if it is easier to call someone by their name? I can speak to this a little bit too, and panelists, if you want to chime in as well, please do. I think, of course, it's just a sign of respect to call anyone, regardless of how they identify by their first names. But I think it's kind of showing that extra you're kind of taking that extra step and showing that extra ounce of respect too. If you're like, okay, even if you're just introducing yourself, like, my name is Justin, I use he, him pronouns. What about you, right? It's as simple as that. That's a good option to either hear, what name they want you to call them and what pronouns they want to be referred to by. And yeah, I think those are great questions, and I'm glad that y'all asked those. Anyone on the panel, did you want to chime in on?
Yeah, I just want to add a couple more remarks on the why pronouns come up so much in these conversations. I think there's two main reasons. The one reason is to avoid outing people, where there may be cases where somebody is presenting a certain way, but they haven't had time to or ability to update their documents, and in which case you wouldn't want to out them to people who they weren't ready to do that with yet. And then I would say the second reason is more of affirming who they are so they feel welcomed.
Beautifully said, Alfred. Thank you so much. All right, I think we can move on to the next scenario. All right. We could go with three. We'll go with three. Sure. All right. Scenario 3. We'll talk about bullying and harassment a little bit. So I'll read this out first. Taylor is currently residing at a congregate shelter. Taylor informed shelter staff that others in the shelter are intentionally using the wrong pronouns and making jokes about Taylor's gender identity and sexual orientation. So question for the panel, we'll start with, how do you think that staff and agency should respond to this?
I mean, I guess I can jump in. I would say that my kind of like gut reaction would be to ask the person first, like before doing anything. Like, I wouldn't want to go and all of a sudden make an announcement or pull people aside or like, try to take some action without conferring with Taylor first to be like, what would help you feel safe? Like, what would you hope for as far as like are the steps we take? What would you hope for as far as resolution overall? Are these people that you would be comfortable with us maybe reaching out to and pulling aside and having conversations with? Would you like us to handle it maybe in a more kind of general way where we have like a call or a meeting or a workshop, something that just gets offered generally that addresses it just to reinforce that it's a priority? Would you like maybe even something more passive like a flyer or a handout or something that can just be posted for people to read at their leisure? Like, I think there's a lot of there's like a spectrum of options of how to respond. And so I would want to really co-create kind of the next steps with Taylor.
Yeah, I would agree that there's sometimes where people will want more action, sometimes they might not want to escalate the situation. I think also if you see this issue come up, this is also a sign where maybe you should think about how the intake process for everybody coming in is, where in addition to asking people what pronouns do you use, you also go over the ground rules of don't harass people, don't make jokes about other people's identity.
Benjamin, I saw you unmute yourself. Would you like to share next?
Yes, but oh, there we go. I was trying to get my mic to work. I think this comes down to a big case of like harassment and of course making sure people feel safe in regards to discrimination. Um, Irregardless of like if it was sexual harassment, if it discriminatory harassment on sexual orientation, or even if it was like racial harassment, I don't think in the workplace or in any kind of setting anybody should have that, because I'm gonna go based off the prompt. It says are intentionally, so we know their intentions are confirming. It's not an investigative, like we have to find out whether it was a mistake or not. These people are actively going against this person and their pronouns and making jokes. Um, I would hit them with the HR answer of, like this needs to end, this needs to stop. Otherwise, repercussions would have to come into place because, and again, in anywhere, anybody should feel safe. Like, no one should go to work having to feel like they're going to be harassed or bullied. I'm on the zero tolerance, even in my own personal life, is that if I see harassment in front of me, I kind of like take this step forward and try to be the person that acts on it. So that it's a very HR kind of answer, but I'm that's where I stand on it.
Not an HR answer, I don't think, Benjamin. I think it's just the reality of it all. And some folks in the chat are agreeing with what you're saying. So I just wanted to bring attention to that. Sarah, would you like to share anything about this?
Yeah, I think when I first my reaction reading it, it went straight to policy because we're a policy office, right? So I was like, people are gonna get in trouble if you do this kind of like things. But I love what Angie and Alfred uplifted with is checking in with the person first to see what would be the best approach. I think that's so important. And on top of this being kind of like an HR policy issue, it's also like you're breaking state law in the state of California. So if there is discrimination going on, then there's a potential lawsuit that may happen if you are not protecting the residents. One thing I do also want to uplift what we hear at the Office of LGBTQ Affairs is that there's also instances where folks that use the facilities, not staff, are also, they may be, intentionally using the wrong name or pronoun, or might make jokes. And we're talking about like residents, right? So this is something that should also, like the space should also be indicative of not only does it apply to staff, but it also should apply to the folks that are using those services. In this case, it would be like either residents or folks that are using the facility. So I just wanted to put that out there too.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you for uplifting what Alfred and Angie mentioned as well. I think each of you shared such great perspectives on just, the severity of this issue. Before we go on to the next scenario, and also I want to point out too, if anyone in the room has any questions about this too, please feel free to put them in the chat and we'll get to them before we move on. One more question. What could the agency do to respond with accountability in the future? Some of y'all touched on this already, but if you have any other ideas on what accountability could look like in a workplace, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, for me, I think like first steps are always to make sure that everyone is aware. And these are where these trainings that y'all partake in are so crucial because it sets that foundational knowledge, just like you went to the training, you know about the policy. So I'm not going to say it's my expectation. My recommendation is that once people take this training, that the policy is sent out so people are aware of what's the policy regarding, making sure that everyone feels respected in this place. And then once you have this foundational setting, then it might lead into kind of like formal documentation, coaching, or policy or things like that. So it's just something to consider in terms of making sure folks are accountable for their actions in the workplace.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to bring attention to a comment in the chat. Someone mentioned that it can be hard to be on top of it 24/7. And of course, I recognize that. I sympathize with that absolutely. But they mentioned that if some folks might in the shelter might have like maybe mental health issues or disabilities, which maybe plays into play with them not being able to control it. I could see how that could be an issue. However, I think from my own standpoint as as a service provider, we don't want to let these things kind of be excuses, I guess, for keeping other folks safe, right? We don't want someone's safety to fall at the expense of another member, right? We want to make sure that everyone is being met where they're at, because we can recognize like, okay, this person might have a need in this area, versus like another person that we're serving might have a need in a different area. And we want to, we don't want to just kind of create like a baseline, for everyone to be met, but we want to make sure that we're like meeting them at those levels and those specific needs. We want to make policies that are inclusive to keep everyone safe, whatever that means specifically for them. Before we move on to the next scenario, any panels would you like to chime in about that?
I was just gonna say that, like, I think for ongoing accountability, like, I'm a big fan, when possible, of like restorative justice. And so I'm not sure to what extent that's been discussed, but I feel like the idea of like acknowledging a harm and doing something to try to repair the harm caused, that can sometimes put people in an awkward situation if they're like the target of the discrimination and they don't want that. But in the event that someone was open to like a reparative conversation, like that's mediated or facilitated, or, asking a person who has like quote unquote offended in this way, to do something for the community at large that helps demonstrate maybe they're the ones who, get involved and help lead a workshop, or bring some sort of educational opportunity to the rest of the group, like get them involved in the follow up, as a part of the conditions of like holding them accountable. Basically, I think that's it could be an interesting way to approach it. And then the other thing I was just going to say was that I don't remember. So I'll just end it there.
Thank you, Angie. I think that was a good note to end on, though. I think that was
Okay,
a beautiful note to end on. So thank you so much. All
thanks.
right, we can move on to the next scenario. All right. We are going to move to scenario 5, and then just so folks in the room have a good idea, we're prioritizing some that might feel most relevant to the work that y'all will be doing. But it looks like we're making great time, so I think we'll have enough time to come back to the others, and then we can get more in depth with those ones too. All right, so let's go into scenario 5. This one will discuss the topic of pronouns, meaning different pronouns in different contexts. All right. Riley asks to use they them pronouns during case management, but he him pronouns when around other program participants and staff. Their case manager is supportive, but is worried that they will use the wrong pronouns in the wrong context. So the first question that we have here is, what strategies could help the case manager remember which pronouns to use in which contexts?
This is just coming from a communication perspective, a communication degree that I have. It's every every conversation is transactional, and of course, receiving that information and remembering it always is going to be like difficult if you're always stressing about it. Practice make perfect, right? Is practice for yourself. If you're a specific case manager, you should have at least some diligence towards your like the person you're working with, so that you're not going to make mistakes. Mistakes will happen, but you're going to intentionally do your best to practice. I know for certain if I had a case manager, I would want them to be working on the things that I've asked them to work on, respective to my case. Um, so it's a diligence of like, all right, I've got to practice he, him, they, them here, and just maintaining that. If ever like a pause before introducing them to other people, just making sure that you're not you're going to be heightenedly aware of it rather than simple carelessness.
To your point, Benjamin, I think that just shows like common courtesy and care for the person you're serving, right? It shows that you're actually paying attention to what they're saying. But for the other panelists in the room, what do y'all think about this?
I think this is also a situation where I say Raleigh's preferences would be important. And there may be a preference to err on one side or the other, depending on the situation. And so that would just be good to sort out.
Yeah, I would say practice makes perfect. I think that's very well said. Y'all like when it comes to me using like non-gender like phrases. Folks think that I'm from the South because I use y'all and folks and like, and I always say like little Southern hospitality doesn't hurt anybody. But a lot of people mistake me like, oh, Sarah, you're from Texas, right? I'm like, no, I'm born and raised in the Bay Area. So it does take a lot of practice. And I think being able to practice and just to not put the burden on Riley, right? Practice with your peers, practice with your pets. It just takes a lot of practice to have that kind of like, as part of just common communication. So practice makes perfect. I agree 100%.
I would say too that like even something as simple as name tags that have the space to write pronouns on them in like, group activities or meetings or things like that. I mean, you can do that under the guise of community building, just like people know each other. And, if people already know each other, maybe if you have a guest speaker or someone come, then you can like still sneak in name tags kind of thing. I would also say though that this is a great question to ask Riley. Like, what do I do if I mess it up? Or, that kind of thing. Like, that way there's a game plan and almost like a safety plan in place, for like a contingency in case that does happen. I would say though that like, I really like the sub question about not making the case manager's concerns Riley's burden to bear. Like, it is not Riley's responsibility to assure or assuage this person that even if they make a mistake, that, don't worry, it's not, I understand, like, blah, 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 like keeping the focus on Riley. And I think when you as a case manager, or if you're working with case managers, if they need support, making sure that there are people and resources and outlets in place for them to do that are not clients. And just, maybe having regular check-ins like during staff meetings, or a form for someone to submit if they ran into a tricky situation that they want follow-up on, or just I think there are ways to scaffold support for case managers. And I think that that's one approach.
Beautifully said, Angie, and I'm really glad that you brought attention to that sub question, because it's absolutely just everything that you mentioned. I want to bring attention really quickly to the question above that, just before we move on, that says what documentation practices might support this. We kind of already touched on this, right, with what Sarah mentioned earlier about having that fill-in option, right, and giving them more options to openly share what they want to, rather than having them, have to choose like certain binary terms that might be on the documentation. Before we move on, were there any other ideas that y'all might have about other documentation practices that could support this? Alfred, I saw you unmute yourself. Would you like to share?
Yeah, I would say this would also be a situation where circumstances may change at some point. And so if I were the staff person, every so often I would check in with Rowley and say, are these still the pronouns that you prefer, in which contexts?
Absolutely. I think check-ins are important. And I think that also falls in line with what Angie was kind of touching on too, about not making this Riley's burden, right? As a client, we don't want to put that extra stress on the person that we're serving. Before we go on to that last question there for other folks on the panel, do you have any other insights on how the case manager might be able to manage their own concerns in this situation without placing that burden on Riley?
One suggestion, maybe asking, have you experienced it in the past, and then how did it go out, so that you're not indirectly asking Riley like, what can I do, but just ask like, has it happened before, and is there some insight that I can gain from that?
Thank you, Benjamin. I think that was well said as well. All right, the last question on this scenario is, are there any clarifying questions that the case manager should ask Riley to help understand Riley's needs clearly?
I think that if like this conversation came up unprompted by Riley, I would have a lot of curiosity around what prompted them to bring this request up, in the sense of like, is there something else going on that I maybe need to be aware of? Like, is it a specific person who tends to be around in a group setting that they don't want that person to know that they want to use they them pronouns, or that they only want to be seen using he him pronouns? Like, is there like a risk of harm or danger, or just emotional hurt, even, kind of what would the impact be? Or not definitely not asking like, well, why do I need to do this, or like justify this to me, but like basically just saying like, totally happy to do it, like just so I understand more. Like, can you talk to me about, very much like what Benjamin was saying, like, what's the impact that it has on you when someone maybe uses they them pronouns in a group setting instead of he him? Or what kind of support do you feel like you would want or need, or what's been helpful in the past when that's happened? Just to kind of have an understanding in advance of like the degree of urgency, or maybe room for, you know, I guess Riley to still have a safe experience.
Absolutely. And I think before we move on to the next scenario, I just want to touch on that. During your training, your facilitators mentioned don't hark on the apology if you mess up too much. That can make it a little bit more awkward, a little bit more intense. We're not expecting you to like know everything immediately off the bat, but like we said, practice makes perfect. Grant yourself that time to learn, but also just take that accountability too, right? So if you are going to be asking any clarifying questions to help understand Riley's situation, and if you do slip up, just take that accountability, apologize, move on, and make sure that you're getting it correct in the future, and also making sure that you're modeling that for your peers as well. Panelists, are you ready to move on to the next one? Cool. All right, let's do it. All right, scenario 7. This one will cover bathroom access. Tyler, who identifies as non binary, is staying at a transitional shelter. Tyler is told by staff to stop using the men's bathroom after another resident expresses discomfort. Staff directs Alex to use a separate staff only single stall restroom. Alex feels singled out and discriminated against, noting that others haven't been required to use a different bathroom. I'm glad that we're talking about this one. It's a very hot topic, unfortunately. I don't think it needs to be as much of a big deal as it is, but well, let's hear from the panelists. So the first question is, how should staff respond in the moment to address the concern without discriminating against Alex?
I'll lead off with this one. First, I would like to first say that the opposite scenario is probably one you may also encounter, where someone would have a preference to use a single stall restroom because they're dealing with harassment in a gendered restroom. So I would say the best way to prevent these issues from coming up in the first place at all is, I would say, a shift towards single stall restrooms for everybody. And so this is something that could be considered with facilities selection and design of facilities. It's early on in the process, this is something that could be addressed in some cases. For this specific situation, though, I think again, this goes back to making sure that there's clear rules for people coming into the facility during intake. Like making it clear that, okay, don't harass people in the bathrooms. If somebody doesn't want to talk to you there, don't talk to them. And I think that could go a long way in both directions.
Would anyone else on the panel like to share? I can speak a little bit to this about like what that looks like in practice, at least like what we do here at the space. But before I get into that, I want to give some space for y'all to share too.
Like the first thing that comes to mind for me, where it says that Alex feels singled out and discriminated against, the first thought is like, as they should, right? Because it is singled out, you are singling out Alex. Oh, I'm sorry. This is yeah. Um, I just feel that when it comes to and just being kind of like realistic, right? There are a lot of spaces that only have men's and women's restrooms, and like I could talk, for the county, for example, like our facilities, although there are gender neutral bathrooms, right? There are older facilities that have only men's and women's. And this is where I feel that if folks don't know about it, they might not implement any kind of policy. In the state of California, folks are welcome to use any restroom that they feel safest and comfortable in. And by, outlining or having staff say that you are to use this restroom only, or we should clear out this restroom before anybody uses it, you're actually breaking like California law. So that's just policy of mine. For me, it really comes on a policy standpoint, and it could be as simple as a memo because it's in line with Title IX here in California, in the Southern California, where everyone's kind of like workplace policies or guidelines for residents and staff alike should outline that, bullying and discrimination is inclusive of gender identity, and it's inclusive of making sure that people have safe and equitable access to the restroom that they feel safe and comfortable in. It might be as simple as a memo letting people know, like, although their bathrooms are not gender neutral, you're welcome to use the restroom that aligns with your gender identity and where you feel safest. And I think it's as simple as that. Just making sure that those guidelines are out there. So I would exercise like making sure that staff knows that that is the policy, and this goes, we stand behind our mission. And if it's not within that kind of like, if it's not clearly stated, then making sure there's a kind reminder that people should be able to access the restroom that they feel safest in.
Yeah,
Beautifully said, Sarah. Yeah, go for it, Benjamin.
just hearing like policies that say like similar, that say like separate but equal, just kind of takes me back to like 1960s and just discrimination across what back then, back racial, but still like today now we're talking like sexual orientation and gender discrimination, and it's still that separate but equal policy has never worked out. Always been a way of like oppressing people in some sense. And in the sense of the bathroom, as Sarah was mentioning, it is California state law to not be discriminated against.
I think that's a good transition to our follow-up question here, which is what optional privacy alternatives can the program offer and to whom without creating separate but equal treatment? Before we move on, I want to bring attention in the chat. Someone shared that they attended another training where they recommended printing off a piece of paper and covering previous gendered signs and making them gender neutral restrooms. I can attest that this works. At our when the youth space was in a transitional space and we were sharing a space with a mental health clinic, we did just that, right? Even though there were like multiple stalls in the restroom, we changed them to be single-use restrooms, right? So only one person can be in there at a time. I mean, I know I prefer that. I don't really need to be in the bathroom sharing space with like everyone else, right? So doing something like that, like if well, first of all, just like everyone else shared, there are policies in place to protect this and protect our folks. However, I think this is a easy and simple tool to navigate it right. You can make your own policies around this, and in terms of making them single use restrooms or all gender restrooms, whatever that looks like. But are there any other insights from the folks in the room about any optional privacy alternatives? Cool. I think we covered it. I think we covered it. Cool. Thanks all for your questions in the chat. Really appreciate it. All right. Shall we go back to a different scenario?
Justin, is it actually okay to mention one of the a question that came up in the chat about like as a homeless trans
Yes, please.
person? Could you read the question again? I think it got
Yeah,
lost in my chat.
yeah. So, in the chat, we had someone asked, for homeless trans folks, they might be more insecure about their housing situation than their pronouns. How are we supposed to be proactive with helping youth understand navigating housing resources? I did respond, because I thought that this could be a good, uh, I guess, good question to direct back to y'all, the home-based staff, with some of the work that y'all are doing. But for anyone in the chat, or in the chat, for anyone in the panel, I'm wondering if y'all might have any insight to this too before we move on, about how we can help youth understand navigating housing resource specifically for trans folks or for other queer folks. Benjamin, did you want to start first? Yeah, go for it.
So I was actually homeless during like a year in college, and I was living in my car and didn't have like a lot of resources because obviously it's hard to like go to your parents because we were fighting, we weren't talking. Um, Even though I was a youth and I wasn't really concerned too much, let's say, about like what people called me, he, him, she, they, them. At the end of the day, I was still like gay, you know? So it's still something to be mindful of because I felt the most comfortable around people that understood me and understand my unique needs. Um, I wouldn't just like go to a case manager or somebody or a youth center to and just talk to anybody who's like, oh, what's up, bro? You know, like I wanted somebody who at least had some level of understanding and care and courtesy towards my my unique walks of life in the world. Despite homelessness being like a universal human issue, there's still like a branch of a specific perspective to like at least hold on to when you're working with people is to understand them.
Thank you for sharing a little bit about your experience, Benjamin. Angie, I saw you on mute as well. Would you like to share?
Yeah, I think that Benjamin and this question just bring up a really, really important point about not assuming what is most salient to someone about their identity or lived experience at any given point in time. Like, I think that, just because someone is transgender doesn't mean that they're not also other things and that they couldn't have other concerns besides gender pronouns. Like, I think to make people kind of linearly issue focused or kind of reduce them down to one part of their identities is really unfair. Like, I think part of being affirming of queer and trans people is affirming our whole humanity and the fact that we are multitudes. And like, I think that in the past, like I've had therapists, for example, who in like intake meetings and stuff would basically assume that like my childhood trauma was tied to my sexuality. And I'm like, actually, no, like it has nothing to do with that. Like, I mean, like that's a totally different thing. And like, so I think stuff like that, where it's like, just because you are queer or just because you are trans doesn't necessarily mean you're traumatized by that identity. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you have trauma tied to that identity. Well, you're certainly like statistically more likely to, like, that doesn't mean that that's all about who you are. I think showing interest in other things and other identities and parts of how people identify, like, about all the different other social identities that we hold, like, I think is really important to creating those safe spaces.
Thank you, Angie. Thank you, Benjamin, for sharing. Any other thoughts before Alfred, go for it.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say, and this goes beyond even just housing services, but having something that people can know when they're looking for services that this place is a welcoming place. That helps a lot because I don't want to spend time or run into problems finding out the hard way if somewhere is going to be friendly or not. And yeah, I know that some places they also have specific facilities that are where or programs for queer people or for trans people. And I think that's always a great thing to have because yes, there's lots of ways to prevent issues and correct issues after they come up. But I think it's just best for everyone if there's a way to avoid them in the first place. And one way to do that is to have a program that people can be referred to. And I think it's also not just for safety and reducing harassment, but also really for building community. There's so much that those of us who are trans learn from each other, where through conversation on, oh, I went through this issue. How did you deal with this issue? And oh, yeah, if you do this, this was my experience. And it's, yeah, there's so many formal resources, but I feel that informal resources and connections can be so important. Like I often say that think about how a lot of different ethnic communities they have their community centers or neighborhoods and the both the protection but also the resources and friendship that can come out of that. And I think this is something that trans people, queer people, other LGBTQ people also benefit from.
That was so well said, Alfred. I think that is exactly why Speakers Bureau exists, right? To be able to share those stories and have lived experiences from one another. So thank you so much for adding that. I think that that was a really important piece to this conversation. All right. Sarah, would you like to share? Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, well, just one thing I want to share. I was just working for Office of LGBTQ Affairs. If organizations aren't actively promoting, and the keyword for me here is like being proactive. Proactive means you're actually intentionally reaching out to trans, non-binary, gender expansive community members. Proactive means making sure that is promoted, that you have kind of like the facilities and the policies in place to make sure that you're able to care for all LGBTQ folks, especially trans, non-binary, and gender expansive folks. And proactive means like making sure that that those resources are well publicized. Like y'all, working in this office, like there's probably like to me there's one, two if we count Bill Wilson Center, right? But from Life Moves they have the what do you call it, New Haven Inn, right? If y'all aren't actively promoting it, if I can easily like Google search like LGBTQ plus inclusive housing resources in the South Bay and your name doesn't come up, then I don't know if it's kind of like a strong resource that I would make a referral to. So I would definitely recommend like what are we doing to outreach, promote, and engage people to let them know that this resource or this area is inclusive and safe for all.
Period. Period. I don't even think I have anything to add to that. Thank you so much, Sarah. Perfect. And I'm seeing
Yeah,
lots of love in the chat for that too. And thank you for your reactions. Alfred, go for it.
yeah, I would say that sometimes when there isn't necessarily space for a specific program or facility, another thing that can be really helpful is just having internal support groups for people who share an identity who are living together. I think back to when I was in college, lived in student housing, and it was also similar where there was group housing, people shared bathrooms and everything. But there were also kind of these support groups where all the trans people would meet every so often just to share concerns, share experiences, and if there were issues to figure out how do we approach this as a community. And just having space and time for that could be really helpful too.
Thanks, y'all. All right, we are reaching the last 5 minutes of our time together. So rather than going back to some of the other scenarios that we skipped for now, let's take a couple last minutes to open questions up to folks in the audience, attendees, folks in the training session. If there are any last questions that you might have that maybe are covering issues that you are curious about, or just anything that you want to learn a little bit more about as well, now's a good time to do it. I wasn't expecting y'all to be a shy bunch, but that's
Okay.
okay. That's okay.
Yeah,
But
I will end with one thing.
yeah,
Then I think it's also really important to hire more queer and trans people, especially for the staff, for two reasons. Both, it helps people coming in feel more comfortable where they see, oh, someone in a position of power here knows is like me and will probably stand up for his me and so on. But also, I think it helps also reduce the homelessness issue too, because part of the reason there is such high homelessness among trans people is a lot of people have trouble finding employment. So anything that can be done to help there helps a lot.
I absolutely agree. In a training that I facilitated yesterday about supporting LGBTQ plus folks, in partnership with the Office of LGBTQ Affairs, actually, we spoke about just this, right? I think it's so important to have folks with lived experiences and with diverse identities informing the work that y'all are doing. So just to double down on what Alfred said, I absolutely agree.
One thing to touch, one of my trans friends, he mentioned this, and he kind of works in San Diego for like politics. He mentioned this: if you're not at the table, you don't get to eat. So representation matters.
Yeah, and in politics, I also hear the saying similar: if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So even more so, where if people don't have power, they're often the ones who are being harassed.
Thanks y'all for sharing and for giving a little bit of a closing remark. I mean, I think that's a good way to sum it up. Sadako or Alicia, before I thank everyone for having us, would y'all like to say anything? I know we have a couple minutes left. I want to be mindful of your time.
No, nothing new. Just really appreciate all of you for speaking today. Really grateful to just have a space that folks feel comfortable with asking questions. And one thing, sorry. I will follow up with everyone here with the slides, so you don't have to worry about that via email. And once the recording is posted on the CoC website, we will share an announcement on that as well. And then we have a feedback survey, which we will share with the slide deck as well. So again, thank you all for attending, and thank you to the panelists for giving us such a great discussion. We really appreciate you all. Thank you.
Thank y'all so much for having us. I hope having some lived experiences and a wonderful, beautiful panel was meaningful to the training that y'all had. And thank you so much for having us. If you're interested in hosting a panel of your own, we're able and willing to talk about anything and everything. So please feel free to get my contact from Sadako or Alicia too, and we would be more than happy to set something up for y'all. So thank you so much for having us.